The wealthy are not smarter than you. They are not luckier. They simply learned something about money that you were never supposed to find out. Most people spend their entire lives chasing income, never realizing that income was never the mechanism, it was the distraction. Solomon, the wealthiest man in recorded history, did not describe wealth as something you earn. He described it as something you inherit through wisdom and lose through the absence of it. One avoided mistake quietly outweighs years of disciplined saving. That is not theory. That is the pattern disciplined families have understood for generations. You were taught to focus on the wrong thing entirely. Wealth does not begin with money. It begins with the quality of decisions made long before money arrives. If that challenges what you were taught, stay until the end. Because what follows will not motivate you. It will restructure how you think. Consider two men. Same city. Same profession, same salary, for 20 years. One retires with financial stability, a clear mind, and no debt. The other reaches the same age with very little to show, not from laziness, not from lack of effort, and not from bad luck. The difference between these two men is not what most people assume. It was not income, it was not opportunity, it was not even intelligence. It was decisions. Small, quiet, repeated decisions made over long periods of time. Decisions about who to trust. Decisions about what to avoid. Decisions about when to move and when to stay still. Most people never think about wealth this way. They have been taught to think about wealth as something you earn, something you find, something that arrives when the right opportunity appears or the right number shows up in your account. But there is a different understanding, one that is older, quieter, and far more reliable. And it begins not with money, but with a question most people never ask. What if the greatest financial advantage is not how much you earn, but how well you decide? The modern world has built an entire culture around income. Work harder, earn more, find a side business, invest in the right thing at the right time. The message is always the same: more activity, more income, more growth. And yet, most people who follow this path find themselves in a cycle they cannot explain. They earn, they spend. They make the same financial mistakes under different circumstances. A new job, but the same spending behavior. A new business, but the same partnership problems. A new investment, but the same impatience that caused the last one to fail. The cycle is not caused by a lack of money. It is caused by a pattern of decisions that keeps producing the same results regardless of how much money enters the picture. A salaried worker earns a raise and immediately expands his lifestyle. A business owner generates new revenue and immediately takes on new expenses. An investor makes a gain and immediately chases a larger position without understanding what he is doing. The money changed. The decisions did not. This is the illusion most people live inside. They believe that if they could just earn more, the problems would resolve themselves. But the problems are not financial. They are structural. They live in the decision-making process, not in the bank account. And until that process changes, more money only produces more of the same results at a larger scale. The frustration is real. Millions of people work genuinely hard and still do not progress. Not because the system failed them, not because opportunity was absent, but because no one ever taught them that the quality of their decisions is worth more than the size of their income. This is not a new observation. Long before financial markets, investment accounts, or business frameworks existed, ancient observers were studying the same problem. Why do some people consistently prosper while others consistently struggle, even when their circumstances appear similar? The answer they arrived at was not luck. It was not talent. It was not divine favoritism. It was wisdom. And specifically, it was the transfer of wisdom from one generation to the next. In the book of Proverbs, a text attributed to Solomon, a man regarded across ancient traditions as the greatest possessor of wealth and understanding in recorded history, there is a principle stated with remarkable simplicity. He who walks with the wise grows wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. Read that carefully. He who walks with the wise grows wise. The mechanism is proximity. The method is observation. The result is growth. Not through trial and error. Not through independent discovery. Through deliberate exposure to proven thinking. In ancient cultures, wealth was not just transferred through inheritance. It was transferred through proximity. The sons of merchants did not simply receive money. They spent years observing their fathers make decisions, watching who they trusted, how they evaluated risk, when they expanded and when they contracted, what they refused and what they chose. The money was secondary. The decision patterns came first. A young man who spent 5 years watching his father negotiate with suppliers, manage relationships, and decline bad partnerships did not need to make those same costly mistakes himself. He had already seen where those paths led. He arrived at his own decisions with 10 or 15 years of observed experience that did not cost him anything. That is not an accident. That is a system. And it is older than every financial theory ever written. Here is where the assumption must be broken. Most people believe wealth begins with money. Find the money, and the wealth follows. This assumption is reversed. Wealth does not begin with money. Wealth begins with decisions. Specifically, it begins with the quality of your decisions before money arrives. Think about it plainly. Two people receive the same inheritance. One builds it into something durable. One loses it within a decade. The money was identical. The decisions were not. Two people start similar businesses in the same industry. One navigates the early years carefully, avoids the common failure points, and builds a stable foundation. One moves quickly, makes the same mistakes every impatient entrepreneur makes, and closes before reaching the third year. The opportunity was comparable. The decision quality was not. Here is a truth that rarely gets stated directly. One avoided mistake is often worth more than several successful investments. A person who avoids a catastrophic business partnership does not just protect his current capital. He protects the next 5 years of rebuilding time. A person who avoids a debt trap does not just save money. He saves the psychological energy, the time, and the compounding loss that debt imposes on every future decision. A person who avoids an impulsive investment does not just preserve capital. He preserves his position to act clearly when a genuine opportunity appears. The value of avoided mistakes is invisible. It never shows up in a financial statement. You cannot calculate what did not happen. But over 20 years, the person who made fewer large mistakes almost always ends up in a more stable position than the person who made more money but made more expensive errors. If that is true, and it is, then learning how to avoid mistakes is a form of wealth accumulation. And the most efficient way to learn how to avoid mistakes is not to make them yourself. It is to learn from people who already have. This brings us to a concept that does not have a common name, but has existed in disciplined cultures for as long as wealth has existed. Call it shadow capital. Shadow capital is not money. It is not an investment account. It cannot be taxed, stolen, or lost in a market downturn. It cannot be seized in a legal dispute or eroded by inflation. Shadow capital is the invisible wealth built from borrowed wisdom, observed decisions, inherited thinking frameworks, and the accumulated patterns of people who have already navigated the financial terrain ahead of you. It lives in the mind. It shapes behavior. It quietly influences every decision you make, what you pursue, what you refuse, how long you wait, and how clearly you see the difference between genuine opportunity and expensive illusion. Most people have very little shadow capital when they begin their financial lives. They make decisions based on assumptions they inherited from their environment, emotions they have never examined, and information they receive from people with no demonstrated track record. This is why the early financial years are often the most expensive. Not because earning is difficult, but because the decision quality is low, and the cost of that low quality compounds quickly. But here is what changes everything. Shadow capital can be built deliberately. It does not require inheritance. It does not require access to elite institutions or privileged networks. It requires one thing above all others: the willingness to learn from lives that are not your own before making decisions in your own. The first structural layer of shadow capital is borrowed experience. Experience is expensive when it is your own. Every significant financial mistake carries a cost that extends far beyond the money lost. It costs time to recover. It costs psychological clarity. It costs the confidence that comes from moving in the right direction. And it costs the compounding progress that would have occurred if the mistake had never happened. But experience is nearly free when it belongs to someone else. A person who spends 1 year studying the decisions of successful and unsuccessful business owners before starting a business does not enter that business blind. He enters it with a map of where the dangerous territory lies. He knows which early decisions tend to end businesses before they gain momentum. He knows which partnerships tend to create structural problems that cannot be resolved later. He knows which financial behaviors tend to signal a business that will not survive. He did not learn these things through personal failure. He borrowed the experience of people who already paid that cost. And the return on that borrowed experience is significant, not because it guarantees success, but because it eliminates the most common and most expensive early mistakes. This is what disciplined families have always understood. Wealthy families do not allow their children to make major financial decisions without counsel. They build informal structures, advisors, mentors, experienced elders whose primary function is not to create opportunity, but to prevent costly decisions before they are made. This is the identity shock that changes how many people see wealth for the first time. Wealthy people are not independent decision makers. They are structured decision makers. They move within frameworks built by generations of observed experience. And that structure, invisible as it is, produces consistency that appears, from the outside, to look like fortune. It is not fortune. It is shadow capital, operating quietly beneath the surface, and the next layer of this mechanism goes deeper than most people ever think to look. There is a pattern that repeats itself across every generation. A person who appears fortunate is studied closely by those around him. They look for the investment he made, the connection he found, the moment he seized. They search for the external event that produced his result. And when they cannot identify it clearly, they conclude it must have been luck. But spend time with that person. Observe how he thinks before he acts. Notice what he refuses before you notice what he accepts. Watch how long he waits before committing to something. Listen to the questions he asks before he agrees to anything. What you will find is not luck. What you will find is pattern recognition, a trained ability to see what a situation is likely to produce before it fully develops. And that ability did not come from instinct. It came from years of deliberate study, quiet observation, and accumulated wisdom that shaped the way he reads every financial situation he encounters. This is the second structural layer of shadow capital. Where the first layer is borrowed experience, learning from the mistakes and successes of others, the second layer is pattern recognition, the ability to identify repeating structures before they reach their conclusion. Business cycles have patterns. Debt traps have patterns. Career instability has patterns. Partnership failures have patterns. Impulsive investment behavior has patterns. And the people who have studied these patterns, not theoretically but through years of observed real-world decisions, can see where a situation is heading long before the outcome becomes visible to everyone else. This is why certain people appear to make consistently good decisions without appearing to work particularly hard at them. They are not more intelligent. They are not receiving information others do not have. They have simply accumulated enough observed patterns that what looks like sharp judgment to others feels, to them, like recognizing something familiar. A merchant who has watched 3 business partnerships collapse over the same disagreement about financial control will recognize the early signals of that same disagreement before it surfaces in his 4th potential partnership. He is not smarter. He is more observant. And his observation, built through proximity to experience, protects him from a cost others will pay. Solomon observed this principle not as theory but as demonstrated reality. In Proverbs, he wrote that a prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. The word prudent here does not mean cautious by nature. It means trained in pattern recognition. Trained to see what a path leads to before walking far enough down it to find out the hard way. That training is not given. It is built. And it is built through the deliberate collection of wisdom from people who have already walked the paths you are considering. Now consider what this means structurally. If borrowed experience reduces early mistakes, and pattern recognition reduces future mistakes, then the person who builds shadow capital consistently is not just protecting himself from isolated errors. He is compressing the cost of the entire learning curve of financial life. Most people spend their 20s and 30s paying the tuition of experience. They make the expensive mistakes, recover, make slightly less expensive mistakes, recover again, and gradually, over decades, develop the judgment that would have served them far better at the beginning. The person building shadow capital deliberately does not eliminate mistakes entirely. He is not infallible. But he enters each decade of his financial life with a level of judgment that others are still developing. He is not ahead because he moved faster. He is ahead because he started with more of what matters, not more money, but more clarity about how decisions tend to unfold over time. This is the hidden leva, the structural truth that most financial education never addresses. Avoiding one large mistake is not just protective. It is generative. It preserves capital that would have been lost. It preserves time that would have been spent recovering. It preserves confidence that would have been damaged. And it preserves the clarity of mind needed to act well when genuine opportunity arrives. Wealthy men do not guess. That phrase is worth keeping close. They do not act on enthusiasm. They do not move because momentum feels good. They move after they understand, after the pattern has been recognized, the experience has been borrowed, and the decision has been examined through the lens of accumulated wisdom. That is not timidity, that is discipline. And discipline, over decades, produces results that no amount of frantic activity can replicate. This is where the anti-HESO positioning must be stated plainly. Constant hustle, the relentless cycle of activity, urgency, and visible effort, is often not a sign of progress. It is frequently a sign of correction. A person who is always moving urgently is often moving to fix something that a better initial decision would have prevented. The disciplined decision maker moves slower in the early phase of any significant financial choice. He asks more questions. He observes longer. He waits for clarity before committing. And because of that slower early movement, he makes fewer corrections later. His path is not dramatic. It does not produce the kind of visible effort that others admire in the short term. But over 10 years, over 20 years, his trajectory is more consistent and his position is more stable than those who moved quickly and spent years recovering from what their speed produced. Slow decisions often create fast progress over decades. This is not a comfortable idea for a culture built on urgency. But comfort is not the objective here. Clarity is, and the clear truth is that most financial instability is not caused by insufficient effort. It is caused by insufficient patience in the decision-making process. Now we arrive at the final and most important shift. Everything discussed to this point, borrowed experience, pattern recognition, avoided mistakes, structured decision-making points, toward a single realization. Wealth is not primarily a financial condition, it is an identity. It is a way of thinking that precedes every financial outcome. The person who has built shadow capital does not think of himself first as an earner, or an investor, or a business owner. He thinks of himself as a decision maker. His primary question in any situation is not, how much can I gain? It is, what does this decision lead to? And have I seen this pattern before? That identity shift changes everything. Because once you define yourself as a decision maker rather than an earner, your daily behavior changes. What you read changes, who you spend time with changes. What you listen to and what you ignore changes. The way you evaluate opportunities changes. And the way you respond to pressure changes. Money becomes a result, not the objective. And when money becomes a result of disciplined thinking rather than the primary focus, it tends to arrive with far more stability and far less cost than when it is pursued directly. This is what Proverbs communicates repeatedly across its chapters. Riches and honor are with wisdom. In her left hand are riches and honor. Wisdom first. The material follows. Not as a guarantee of outcome, but as a natural consequence of a disciplined way of thinking applied consistently over time. The daily practice that builds shadow capital is simpler than most people expect. It does not require an expensive education or access to elite networks. It requires one decision made consistently, every day. Spend deliberate time learning from people who are 10 to 20 years ahead of you in the specific areas where you are making financial decisions. Not motivational content, not performance, not entertainment, dressed as education. Biographies of people who've built durable wealth across decades. Documented accounts of business decisions both successful and failed, and the reasoning behind them. Interviews with experienced investors, business owners, and professionals who reflect openly on what they would have done differently and what they would do again. The purpose is not inspiration. The purpose is pattern collection. Every hour spent studying the decision patterns of experienced people is an hour of borrowed experience added to your shadow capital. Over weeks, this becomes a foundation. Over months, a framework. Over years, a lens through which every financial situation you encounter is filtered through accumulated wisdom rather than isolated instinct. This is the daily ritual. Quiet, consistent, unglamorous, and profoundly powerful over time. But there is a warning that must be stated before this closes. The greatest threat to shadow capital is impatience. Impatience is not simply a personality trait. In financial life, it is a structural vulnerability. It causes people to act before they understand. It causes them to move before the pattern is clear. It causes them to accept the appearance of opportunity before they have examined what that opportunity typically leads to in the experience of others who have seen it before. Many expensive financial mistakes are not caused by ignorance. They are caused by knowing enough to feel confident but not waiting long enough to develop genuine clarity. The person who moves just before understanding arrives often pays a higher price than the person who knew nothing at all because he acted with the confidence of partial knowledge, which is one of the most costly positions in financial life. Patience is a financial advantage. Not patience as passivity, not waiting without purpose. Patience as disciplined restraint in the space between interest and action. Filling that space with borrowed experience and observed patterns before committing. Allowing understanding to arrive before movement begins. The wise move after they understand. That single practice, applied consistently over a lifetime, produces a financial trajectory that most people will never achieve, not because they lacked the opportunity, but because they never learned to wait long enough for wisdom to arrive before acting. Some people spend their entire lives focused on earning more money. They chase income, they chase opportunity, they measure their progress in the size of their accounts and the speed of their growth. And many of them arrive at the later decades of their lives with very little to show for decades of effort, not because they failed to earn, but because they never stopped long enough to build the invisible foundation that durable wealth requires. Others spend their lives quietly learning how not to lose. They collect decisions from experienced people the way others collect income. They study patterns before they act. They build structures around their decision-making before they build strategies around their money. They move slowly enough to see clearly, and clearly enough to move at the right moment. Over time, these two paths produce results so different that the people on them can barely understand each other's financial reality. The greatest financial advantage is not money. It is not education, talent, or opportunity. It is knowing what to do before money arrives. And knowing what not to do when it does. That knowledge is shadow capital. It cannot be taken from you. It does not depreciate. It does not require favorable conditions to function. And it grows every single day that you choose to learn from the experience of others rather than waiting to pay for your own. Wealth begins with listening. It is built in silence. And it compounds quietly for those disciplined enough to treat wisdom as the first investment, not the last. If this changed how you think about wealth, not just what you know about it, share it with someone who is still focused on the wrong thing. Every video on this channel is built on the same foundation, ancient thinking, applied to modern financial life. Subscribe to continue.